Hi, everybody, it's Chris, and today I'm going to be talking to you about the Song of Solomon. I'm doing my lessons on human sexuality, the restoration of sexuality after abuse, and freedom in the marriage bed. And it's been interesting. It's been the unit I've struggled with the most, just because I'm no expert. Um, I'm doing research on Song of Solomon because I thought, well, let's start with the foundation, because I think people would agree that Song of Solomon is the picture that God has for us in marriage and in our marriage intimacy. And I started with it, and I thought, well, let me go ahead and do some research on Song of Solomon, because I don't know, I'm no expert. I mean, by its very nature, sex is private. So, I don't know if I'm doing it right or if I have the right attitude. And so, as I looked at scripture, I thought and found it very interesting what the Bible is not. What the Bible is not is, it is not a rule book of sexuality. It is not 10 steps for orgasm. It's not, you can do this, but you can't do that. There is a hedging in or protection of boundaries that God gives for sexuality, and that is sex is for marriage between a husband and woman, that you should not awaken love before it's time, because there's problems when you do. If you awaken your sexuality before it's time, there's going to be issues. It talks about that the marriage bed is undefiled, and therefore it's like a holy place where we can come together unashamed. That there shouldn't be anybody else involved in the marriage sexual relationship. So that means there's no other people, there's no threesomes or 12somes or anything like that, and there's no pornography, because when pornography comes in, then that means within one's imagination there's another person besides the spouse in the marriage bed. And so, other than those boundaries, that God is in the Bible, he's not like Cosmo. 10 steps for marital intimacy. He's silent on that. So I went to Song of Solomon because I thought, well, before we deal with the shame of abuse, before we deal with the struggles and I've had my people in my class write me questions anonymously about some of the things that they might struggle with. Before I go into that, let's talk about the foundation of the good of our human sexuality that God made. And what I found as I studied, and I went to study Song of Solomon, is I found that over the years, over the 2,000 years since Jesus died on the cross, as the scripture came to light, when scholars, priests and whatnot, would evaluate Song of Solomon, what happened was that as they looked at it at first glance, if you looked at it without a scholarly point of view, you would say, oh my gosh, this is just about a hot sexual relationship between a husband and a wife. But the priests and whatnot over time said, well, this can't be, and certainly God is more prudish, certainly the Bible, the holiness and the shame, I guess, that maybe the priests themselves had, said, well, this can't be. It can't be what it seems at first glance. So therefore, it must be a scholarly writing, a parable of the deep ecstasies of the church. It must be an allegory of Christ in the church and the deep spirituality. And I'm not saying that there's not an allegory there, but what I'm saying is that they just pretty much said that at first glance, the sexual references cannot be so. I think when I was doing my research, Calvin and the Presbyterians were the first one that were kind of like the emperors and the emperor, the boy with the emperor and no clothes. Like, well, to me, it looks like it's talking about a hot, sexual, passionate relationship between a husband and a wife. And, that I decided to read the Song of Solomon and just do Chris's interpretation. And what I found is, first of all, there was freedom to explore one another's bodies. There weren't rules about the nitty-gritty of the details of the sexuality. They looked and loved each other from head to toe. The other thing that I found as I read and I studied Song of Solomon is it was about, to me, and of course each person would have to read it on their own. I just decided to do Chris's shorthand interpretation. To me, not only was it about the passion of the sexual acts, but it was about the relationship. I noticed that the Shulamite woman, who's the wife, talked about how dark skinned she was, and that pretty much like, don't judge me. Don't judge how I look, because I've been out in the fields and I've had work to do. In other words, like for me, don't judge my cesarean scar. I carried a baby, and that's part of the things that my body endured. In other words, I'm going to love my body because that's part of my life story. It's part of me. And I thought that was interesting. It talked a lot about them longing and desiring each other. In other words, being separated for a period of time and then wanting to come back together again. Being separated, wanting to come back together again. And I just thought about how in our marriages, that's what our lives are like. We get separated, life's busy, we go to work, we have days, we get dinner on the table, but then we want to come back together again. And that desire to be with one another and to connect in a sexual way in the intimacy of the sacred marriage bed was something that really spoke to me. Another thing that I thought was interesting is there was a part or a period of time where Solomon withdrew. He wasn't around, and the Shulamite woman went after him. And I thought about how when you've been married for a long period of time, our sexual relationship is our thermometer for our relationship to see how we're doing with one another. I've heard it said that as the sexual relationship goes, so goes the marriage. And not to say, because there are times where illness comes in, maybe there's erectile dysfunction for a period of time that has to get fixed. There's stressors that you have to abstain for a period of time, right after you have a baby. But, if things aren't the way they used to be, the Shulamite woman, she went after Solomon and pretty much pursued him, like, what's going on? Why isn't our relationship what it should be or what it used to be? And I think that this is a good teaching for marriage, that when things aren't how they used to be, that to go talk and find out what the problem is. The desire for sexual intimacy drove the Shulamite woman and Solomon into real personal intimacy. To get that connection back, they had to talk and communicate and come back together. And I thought that was really interesting. One of the things that I found that I liked the best about reading the book was Solomon and the Shulamite woman pretty much communicated to each other, like, aren't we the best at this? Like, aren't we great? Kind of like, I wonder if everybody else has what we have. And it made me think about why God didn't go into the gory details or give any rules, because I think for each couple, you discover delights within one another and ways to please one another that you kind of feel like that you discovered the universe. Like, I hung the moon, and I hope for everybody that there's this kind of feeling like what we have is special. And I think that is why God didn't go through all the gory details and didn't give us that, is he wants each of us to discover the delights of pleasing one another and receiving pleasure from one another, so that we know that what we have as a couple is this unique, beautiful, intimate thing that we don't share with one another. And we can't call it, we know that's why pornography does such a detriment, because it only focuses on the physical of strangers. And, for me, like, the few times that I've watched pornography before, God dealt with me, it's like I feel such contagious shame, I guess, because I see the people as people, and I'm kind of like, oh, you poor thing, like, how is this destroying your soul? How is this destroying your heart? And so God intended for us to have this intimate and private thing. Like, you don't compare notes. It's just something we don't talk about one to another. It's our private, intimate thing. And it is a parallel of Jesus and our private, intimate moments with him in our heart, that there's some secrets that we share with one another that we just don't share with anybody else. The other thing that I remember reading as I studied Song of Solomon is there was a kind of a period of time where the reference I got is Solomon wakes up the Shulamite in the night, and she's just like, really? Like, do I have to put my shoes on? Do I have to wake up and put my robe on? In other words, she kind of rejected him sexually. And yeah, not that, and no one wants to be woken up in the night, so to speak. But that rejection, when she rejected him sexually, it hurt him. And he withdrew from her sexually. And then she went and pursued him. So there were times where he pursued her and she pursued him, and to make sure that the sexual relationship was what it should be. And so I guess I just would encourage all of you, it's only, eight chapters long, to just sit down and read it with your own eyes and ask God to show it to you and see what you get out of reading the Song of Solomon. So that is going to be our basis, the equality of the sexual relationship within the two of them, and then we'll go on to talk about shame and the hindrances from abuse when our sexuality was tainted through the world and through sin against us. So anyway, it's an interesting chapter. It is not necessarily in my comfort zone, but I think it's someplace that we have to go. It was probably the first thing that's stolen in our youth with abuse, and so it is definitely something that God is restoring and will restore to us if we just open up and receive from Him. So thank you, and bye for now.